Okay, welcome everyone. Hopefully we've got everyone visible on the hello screen visible to everyone. And thanks for joining us today for another Beaty at Home session. This one will be on textiles. We will start in a few minutes, but just to make sure, any questions that you might have, please enter those into chat box. Let's see, we are live on Facebook. So depending on the numbers, we may just have people ask questions live, but to begin with, I think we will turn off video and audio once our speaker gets started. But I do encourage you to use the chat box. So I hope everyone is doing well. Here we are at the end of summer already. I can't believe it. Where did it go? But definitely cool air in the mornings and into the afternoon. So much for swimming. Okay. And just a few more minutes here. We'll let a few more people in.
Okay.
Oh, good. More people are joining. That's nice.
Great. Okay. I'm going to go off video. Hi, everyone.
Okay, a few more joining. Thanks, Nancy. And I'm going to turn down my radio a bit here. Oh my. Okay, I have 1 p.m. here, so I am going to start this program, Beaty at Home. And here we are at home in the Beaty Biodiversity Museum with our lovely big blue whale in the background here. And our session this afternoon is with Mary Glasper, who is a materials developer experimenter. So yes, I'll get to Mary a little bit later on. I'm Sheila Byers and I'm a museum interpreter here at the Beaty Biodiversity Museum. Nancy Lee is our backup here to help out and support the program. Where is the Beaty Museum located? It is at the University of British Columbia, and we are on the unceded, traditional, and ancestral territory of the Musqueam. This is a flag that was raised, that was designed by the Musqueam and raised at the university in 2019. So I encourage you to check the website for the Musqueam here, musqueam.bc.ca, and also to check out First Peoples map of BC at this website. We are very privileged to be sharing this territory with the Musqueam. Where are we in terms of geography and Vancouver? Way out here at the very tip of Point Grey, where you will find lots of other museums and galleries, such as the Museum of Anthropology, the Botanical Gardens, the Belkin Gallery, many other excellent places to visit. So when you make a trip out here, you have lots to choose from. From Main Mall, we are looking at the museum and again, seeing our big blue whale on the inside there. The Beaty Biodiversity Museum is part of the Biodiversity Research, or sorry, the Beaty Biodiversity Center, which also includes the Research Center, to which the museum is directly connected through the floor level as well as upper levels. And there are at least 50 faculty and their graduate students who are all undertaking various biodiversity related disciplines such as ecology, evolution, taxonomy, communities, conservation, climate change, mathematics, genetics, and many interdisciplinary combinations thereof. The museum carries 6, or I should say archives, 6 different collections, all of which are color-coded with these special symbols, one over here, 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 and here. So we have the tetrapods, which is the mammals, amphibians, reptiles, and birds. And then we move into the marine invertebrate collection, which has everything from sponges to worms to crustaceans, sea stars, all of those it's a very diverse group. It's a small collection, but very diverse. Next, we head to the herbarium, House of Plants, which in fact includes things like your non-vascular plants, bryophytes, to your vascular plants, algae, lichens, fungi. Then we move into the insects and the collection, which includes, it's almost as large as the herbarium collection, and it includes things, insects, spiders, centipedes, millipedes, that sort of thing. Into the other types of vertebrates compared to our tetrapods, and that is the gill-breathing ones that we call fish in blue. We also have both bony and cartilaginous fish. And then in red, we will find the fossils. So lots, which is actually managed by the Pacific Museum of the Earth. So many, many collections, some of which are date back to the 1800s. Ooh, what am I doing here? This doesn't look like my, oh, sorry. Eek. That's very odd. I seem to have a different image here. However, we have over 2 million specimens in the museum. And as you can see, one of our very special exhibits here on insects will be replaced soon since it has just been dismantled. But I'm going to push back up here because where I think our speaker today is going to focus is covering a number of these 6 different collections. I was going to try and narrow into the plants or the herbariums, but I think she's going to be broader than even that. So Mary Glasper is our guest speaker, and I think she has some very fun and exciting types of things to tell us about textiles. So I'm going to stop sharing here and turn it over to Mary.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. Here, I'm just going to share my screen with you folks quickly. Okay, does that work? We're good?
Yes, we're good.
Action. Fantastic. Okay. So yeah, thanks again for having me. I'm excited to be here and to talk to you folks today about textiles and the natural world. It's when I was thinking about what to talk about in this presentation, there's a lot we could talk about. So this presentation is very, I think, general in nature. And if at any point throughout this talk, if you have a quick question and you want to ask a bit more in-depth questions about what I'm talking about, feel free to pipe up. I told the folks at the Beaty that they could interrupt me and we could have a chat as we go. So don't be shy. Just to give you an idea of who I am and what I do, I am what you would call a textile scientist. One reaction I get to that often is, oh, so you're a fashion designer. And it's like, no, I work in the apparel industry, but I actually work with mills. I kind of am the link between design and with mills, and I help create fabrics to meet specific needs and address specific kind of performance requirements. So part of why this talk is neat to me is I actually have a biology degree. I started off working in biology. My background is in entomology, more specifically. I used to work at a museum. I'm from Edmonton. I used to work at the Royal Alberta Museum in the bug room. Textiles has always been a hobby of mine, and I kind of ended up turning that into a career. So yeah, that's why I'm here. And yeah, so I'm in Vancouver. I work for one of the big apparel companies here in the city, and I develop materials, textile materials. So today, really broadly speaking, we're going to talk about natural materials that are used in textiles. So the origin and how they're used between kind of raw material inputs as well as some kind of treatments and dyes that we work with. Not all of this is specific to the industry as a whole. Some of it's kind of hobby, some of it's larger scale. We're also going to talk about some kind of sustainability considerations. This could be an entire talk in and of itself, so it's not going to be exhaustive, but just a really basic overview of some of the issues we're facing and some of the tools that the industry is using to help kind of address these issues. And then finally, just a really brief look at some neat developments happening in this area. Again, not exhaustive because it's a very large area of research, and that could quickly, again, be an entire talk all unto itself. But hopefully we'll do a little bit of everything that will kind of pique your curiosity. And I've tried to share things that will help you know where to look if you want to find out more, or you can always obviously ask questions. So let's just dive right in to natural materials to start off with, the origin and use of naturally derived textiles and treatments in our lives. So first off, I'm sure many of you tuning in are kind of aware of this, but let's just really start at basics. If you look inside your shirt, a textile label, if you're looking at a fiber content label, that's telling you basically the raw material that textile product is made from. And so this is a really basic kind of organization of how we classify those fibers. So you've got natural and manufactured. Under the manufactured umbrella, you have things like synthetics that historically have been made from petrochemicals, so like nylon, polyester, acrylic, those kinds of things. Under the manufactured umbrella, we also have what we call regenerated or man-made cellulosics, which are cellulose-based in that they are derived from plant material, and I'll go into more detail, but they are technically a manufactured fiber because of how they're produced. And then we move into the natural fibers, so plant fibers like cotton and linen, animal fibers like wool and silk, and I have mineral down there, asbestos. Technically asbestos is a mineral fiber, but based on today's talk, this area in the box is kind of what we're going to be focusing on. So let's start off with animal fibers. Broadly speaking, these are protein-based fibers, and in the case of, there's kind of like two main kinds of protein fibers. Hair fibers, basically, which are predominantly keratin proteins, and silk fibers, which are predominantly fibroin proteins. And there's many different types of animal fibers depending on the animal it comes from, basically. You've got wool, silk, cashmere, llama, alpaca, angora. I'm sure many of you have seen these names on fiber content labels before. So just an example here on the left-hand side, I found this really neat image of a superfine merino wool fiber on the left here. And on the right, this is a typical human hair. So that kind of gives you a neat idea of kind of the scale that we're talking about here for some fibers. So this handsome beast right here, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, I hope so. This handsome beast right here is a Merino Ram. So this guy would be the source of a lot of wool fiber that you would buy, especially for wool products that you're wearing next to skin. So something like an icebreaker shirt, for example. There's other species, there's other breeds of wool where the wool that comes from those sheep, you probably wouldn't want to wear next to your skin, but I'll show you that in a second. Cashmere comes from cashmere goats, and alpaca comes from alpacas. So the size of these images is a little wonky because I was trying to actually like match up the scale just to give you a sense of what we're looking at here. So again, on the very left-hand side here, I just cropped that image from earlier. So this is that fine merino. This particular fiber is about 18 microns. That's one way of describing the fineness of wool fibers is by their diameter measurements, basically. It's not the finest by any means, but that's kind of typical. And then we also have here a fiber from a Lincoln sheep, just for an example. This is 60 microns in diameter. And you can see how, when you zoom in at this level, you can actually see the surface roughness of that fiber. And so when you react to wool, when it feels really itchy and scratchy, that's what you're reacting to is the scales on the surface of the wool fiber. And so if they're really prominent and the fiber is quite coarse, it can be more uncomfortable than if they're a lot smoother and the fiber is quite fine. So that's one reason why cashmere is so lovely. If you see this photo in the middle, where the scales are so smooth, like there's barely any surface texture, and it's such a fine fiber. If I zoom in here so that it's no longer at the same scale as everything else, you can see that. And then on the right here, I have alpaca, quite a large fiber. If for any of you crafters who may be in the audience, if you have kind of a wool alpaca blend yarn, you'll notice oftentimes that the alpaca fibers stick out quite a bit and they're quite visible, but they're not very coarse, and you can see that because of the surface texture, the reduced surface texture, not as prominent. So then if we move on to silk fibers, the vast majority of silk that you see on the market, I would say like 90+% of it, comes from one species of moth called Bombyx mori, or the mulberry silk moth, or the cultivated silkworm. And how their silk, basically they've been selectively bred over like thousands of years to produce very large quantities of silk. One cocoon here is basically one single filament of up to like 1,000 meters long that's reeled off all in one continuous filament. In the middle here, you've got wild or tussa silk. For any of you who've spent any time in Granville Island in the market, the silk weaving studio, they actually sell tussa cocoons and tussa silk. And this one, generally, the adults are allowed to emerge from these cocoons, and as such, that kind of interrupts that one continuous filament. And then you have to kind of process the fiber differently than from typical silk that you can process as a filament, where it's that really long, smooth, luxurious fiber. Still really beautiful, and it has a lot of really lovely qualities in and of itself. It's just different. And I included spider silk here as well. And I'll talk about this towards the end of the presentation. I could talk at length about spider silk, and I have done, and we can share a link to other talks I've done on this if you're interested, but I included spider silk here just because it's a material that researchers are really interested in. A lot of work is being done in trying to kind of mimic spider silk properties, because it's not really as easy to collect as caterpillars and like cocoon silk. But I just wanted to pop that up here just to acknowledge its existence, but it's not used widely in the textile industry yet. And then I just wanted to throw this image up here just so you could see what reeling silk looks like. And you can see here that the silk filaments are so fine that you have to reel many cocoons at a time to actually make one silk thread. So if you picture a silk tie, and if you think about how many cocoons were used to produce one of the yarns that were used to make up that entire tie, that's a lot. A lot of insects went into the making of that particular product, which is why silk is so expensive. One of the reasons why it's so expensive. Okay, so moving on to plant fibers. Again, if anyone has questions, feel free to interrupt me while I'm talking, but I'll just keep going otherwise.
May I interrupt just for a second?
Yeah, absolutely.
With the silk, when looking at that one image previous. Yeah, how are the ends of those threads of all of those cocoons actually attached to that mechanism that is now going to wind them?
Right.
I mean, is that manually done or?
Usually, it depends on where this is happening, like what country you're in and what facility you're in. For the most part, there's definitely manual work involved. But you can see how they're kind of in a bath there. You have to soak them in warm water. Sometimes they add a little bit of surfactant or soap in there to kind of help break up the glue that kind of holds the silk together in that cocoon. It's a protein called sericin that is largely water soluble. And so they'll soak that for a bit, and then they kind of brush the outside of the cocoon to try to find that loose end. And then they pull that loose end, and then they kind of find all of the ends and then attach them to a reel and then kind of wind it up.
Wow, thank you. Wonderful. Okay, just a couple of more questions. I might as well
sure
go
thing, yeah.
Are there mills in Canada? I guess we could think about wool processing mills.
So the question is just, are there mills in Canada?
Correct. This is from
in general. Yes, there are mills in Canada. Canada's textile industry is nowhere near as large as it once was, but it still exists. Most of it is out in Eastern Canada. So like I personally used to work at a mill in Montreal, and a lot of them these days are a lot more specialized. So it really depends on kind of what you're talking about. But for example, across the country, there are still a number of spinning mills for like hobby wool supply. So there's just a couple off the top of my head I know of are custom woolen mills in Alberta. There's Briggs & Little are in New Brunswick, if I'm not mistaken. They're on the East Coast. I love their yarn. I like knitting with their yarn very much. And there's a number of kind of smaller, more local yarn suppliers in Canada. And then as far as kind of more industrial scale production, there's a number of mills in the Montreal area, mostly Montreal and surrounding area, where there's a few weaving mills still, there's some knitting suppliers, there's some dyeing and finishing, and there's some textile research happening in that area as well.
Cool. Okay, so still a very active industry.
Yeah, not on the same scale, but definitely still happening. Yeah.
Okay, one more question here from Nancy. Merino is often touted as not absorbing body odors. I wonder if the merino sheep are not as stinky as other sheep. And how do they, okay. So she was asking the same thing about reeling in the silk. So maybe just talk about that merino.
Sure. It's not actually merino specifically that's like more odor resistant than others. It's kind of a property of wool in general, because of it's combination of kind of the protein structure and the physical structure of the fiber. Unfortunately, I don't have like a cross section I can show you. At some point, we can touch base afterwards if you're still curious, but I think merino is often touted as that just because that's what's most commonly used in apparel. So that's kind of what we think of. And most apparel companies use that as base layer materials as an alternative to something like polyester, which can really hold odor unless you treat it with anti-odor or antimicrobial treatments. But basically, it's a combination of things where the outside of the wool fiber is hydrophobic, or it kind of repels water naturally, and the core of the fiber is hydrophilic. And wool has what we would call a very high moisture regain. It can absorb. So one of the reasons why people love wool so much is it can absorb a lot of moisture while still maintaining its insulation properties. And as far as the odor thing is concerned, it's more of a chemistry situation. It's not that it doesn't ever stink or that it doesn't have any odor, but it's when you compare it to other alternatives, especially things like polyester or polypropylene, there's something about its chemical makeup where it doesn't hang on to those kind of odorous compounds as much as some of the synthetic fibers do. And I'm not an expert in that area, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, but I did volunteer in a study once where I had to smell sweaty t-shirts and rate them on a scale. So, those are the things you do for grocery money as a grad student. No, it was genuinely an interesting study, but it's more having to do with some of the synthetic materials out there that are particularly bad for smelling. It's because they're part of the reason is they're more oleophilic. They attract oil, and it's hard to kind of let that go. And there's something about that interaction between kind of like the oiliness and certain components of odor-causing molecules and the chemistry of the fiber itself, where it kind of hangs on to that more. I don't know if that made a lot of sense, but
no,
yeah.
that's very helpful. There's a few more questions, but I think we should probably let you move on before we go to those.
Okay, sounds good.
Good.
Okay, so let's just kind of blast through some plant fibers here too. So plant fibers are cellulose based. I have a cellulose molecule up here for your reference. And generally they're categorized by where they come from the plant. So for example, seed fibers, cotton is a type of seed fiber, same with something like milkweed, which is a bit more of an experimental fiber right now, or kapok, which is not super common, but I think it's becoming a bit more common. I see it in, I've seen it in some kind of like Thai, like import stores where it's a very common like cushion stuffing material. Bast fibers are categorized, so they come from the stem of the plant, so flax. Linen comes from flax, and hemp fibers and jute fibers. So those are all coming from the stem of the plant. I'm actually wearing a linen top right now. And then of course leaf fibers come from the leaf. It's fairly self-explanatory. And then you kind of just have the other category depending on how that fiber might be processed and used. So just some example here, you've got your cotton fiber attached to that seed there, and then these are flax plants, and then piña, which comes from the pineapple plant. They're fibers that are extracted from the leaves of the pineapple plant. So I just have a visual here as well, just showing you what some of that processing looks like. So when it comes to cotton, the fiber has to be separated from the seed, and then effectively the fibers are kind of combed, brushed, aligned in some way, so that you get kind of, instead of having just kind of like a chaotic mass of fiber, you get them into this kind of thin mat that's more or less, the fibers are kind of oriented in more or less the same direction, and then that you can kind of gradually reduce and then spin it into a yarn. And with hemp, it has to undergo a process called retting. So you kind of have to release those fibers from the stem of the plant, which are often kind of encased in pectins or lignins and other kinds of more like tough materials that you don't actually want in the finished product. You just after those fibers. Fun fact, apparently the fibers in bast fibers are actually the phloem of the plant, which is kind of neat. So they're basically like, you can actually see, I have a picture later on where you can see a microscopic image of it, and you can actually see like individual like cells, how it's kind of stacked, which is really cool. And then here's just an image of an example of how leaf fibers can be extracted, scraping and pulling the fibers out. So yeah, here's that image I was talking about. So this kind of sums up some of the natural fiber inputs, so you can just kind of get a broad comparison. And so linen, this isn't the best image I've seen, but you can kind of see here, these are called nodes. So when you're looking at a linen fiber under the microscope, this is a telltale sign that this is a linen fiber. And it's hard to tell from this direction, but in cross section, the fibers are actually hexagonal, which is also a really obvious way to identify linen fibers. And cotton's really neat because it's effectively just a collapsed spiral twisted tube. And I suspect this is part of the reason why cotton has better wrinkle resistance, not like awesome, but better wrinkle recovery than linen does, because it kind of has a bit more resilience like built into its structure than linen, which kind of wrinkles if you look at it sideways. And then on the right hand side here, you just have an example of a typical synthetic filament that's just been extruded. So it looks kind of like, uncooked spaghetti effectively. And then going into, I mentioned earlier about regenerated or man-made cellulosics. So these are kind of that like bridge material where they're like manufactured, but they come from natural inputs. So these again are 100% cellulose. And if you're looking at a fiber content label, anything, if you see something acetate, modal, lyocell, rayon, these are all man-made cellulosic fibers. Generally what's involved is you take an input, usually wood pulp, that's dissolved, and then it's kind of reconstituted into that cellulose again, and it's extruded as a filament, not unlike polyester or nylon. This one is an area for confusion, and I'll just take a quick moment to kind of touch on this one. So a riveting read is the Government of Canada website on textile labeling requirements, if you want to have a few hours you want to spend reading about that. But they kind of do an overview of what the difference is between all of them. It basically has to, it boils down to the process that's used to create that fiber. So it can be, rayon is kind of like the overarching, like, generic term according to the Government of Canada, but that can, within that, you can call it cupro, cupramonium, rayon, viscose, lyocell, modal. There's a number of different ways you can label that. But like the big three that you might come across, that I certainly come across most often, are viscose, modal, and lyocell. And what those are basically, viscose I think is like by far the most common. This is what it looks like under the microscope, and those kind of serrated, it kind of, that collapsing in with that serrated edge is kind of it's like a classic indicator, and that's just a byproduct of the viscose process. Modal is also a viscose process, but it's slightly modified, modal, very creative naming, to give it a slightly higher wet strength, because viscose is actually quite, it loses a lot of its strength when it's wet. You may notice that if you've ever accidentally ripped something, tugging something that's made from rayon out of a washing machine, it's a lot more delicate when it's wet. And then lyocell, which I think industry-wide is kind of the gold standard in terms of especially the environmental impact of these fibers. It uses what we call closed loop process, meaning that the chemicals that are involved in dissolving that pulp and then reconstituting it, you can recover them, they can be reused, and in general, they're a lot less harsh than the chemicals that are used in other regenerated cellulosic processes. And then bamboo. If you ask any textiles person about bamboo fibers, oh my God, it's a can of worms. But like, long story short, if you have something that's lovely and soft and drapey and the fiber content label says bamboo, I call shenanigans. So bamboo, true bamboo, is a bast fiber. And if it was, so it would have to be processed similarly to how you would extract flax or jute. In the case of bamboo, I think those fibers will be quite coarse for the most part. So it would probably feel more like a potato sack, so jute, than it would like a really nice, soft kind of cottony material. And this is like the FTC a number of years ago went on this like tirade of these like amazing punny business alerts, like how to avoid bamboozling your customers. But basically, if you come across a company that is labeling the product as bamboo, but they're not specifying that it's actually bamboo rayon or rayon made from bamboo, that's a big no-no, and it's false advertising. And one of the appeals of using bamboo has been it's, grows quickly. It's more renewable than clear cutting forests for wood pulp, which, not wrong, but I think it's become so popular that it's not unlike, stories of people clear cutting forests in the Amazon to make way for like cow pasture. It's one of those things where it's like, it's become so popular that people are actually having destructive practices trying to make room for this. So, do your research, be a skeptic, buy with caution, but that was just a little public service announcement from me. Now you can be that guy and go into a store and be like, did you know? So you're welcome. So before we move on to dyes, does anyone have any follow-up questions from the basic like fiber categories we talked about?
So there was one from Laura, which you may have covered, and it was, can you clarify the man-madeness of regenerated cellulose? It's natural, but also sort of not. And you did touch upon chemical and processing types. So if there's anything else you want to add there?
Yeah, so it's like natural in that it's like cellulose and it came from natural inputs, but it's not like you're just taking the plant and like extract it, like say with cotton. You're not taking the plant, the cotton seed, pulling the fibers off of it, combing that and making it into a yarn. You are taking that plant input. In many cases, it's wood chips or wood pulp. You're dissolving it and then you're reconstituting it as a fiber. There's that extra step where it's kind of, it's no longer resembling the thing it came from. but the basic chemistry like is similar in terms of what it's made from.
So if I could just take that one step further. So if it's cellulose, which is very, or does that include lignin, which tends to be very tough, and is it therefore acidic type of chemicals that are used to change?
Yeah, there's a range of different chemistries that are used depending on the type, like depending on the process. So I'm not going to go into like a ton of detail there, but generally, yeah, cellulose is more vulnerable to acidic. Like you probably use acidic chemicals to break it down. It's more vulnerable to acid degradation. Oftentimes, you actually use like strong basic solutions to do like desirable things, like mercerizing cotton is immersing it in like a highly basic solution. Lignin wouldn't be involved. So like the input material might have lignin in it, but it wouldn't be extracted. Like it wouldn't be part of the finished product. So that chemical the chemical process would separate the cellulose from the lignin.
Right. Okay. And Laura says, thank you for that. Maybe we should cover this. Sorry, it goes back to the earlier discussions about silk, but rather than lose this, sorry, let me find it again. How do you degum the cocoons?
Yes. Generally, you don't degum the cocoon specifically unless an adult has emerged from it, and you have to process it as what we call staple length or short length fiber, as opposed to a filament, where we would be extracting that one long fiber. But degumming silk in general happens if you're working with the one long fiber. You would degum the silk, the fabric after it's woven, because the sericin kind of helps protect the filaments while you're weaving or knitting. But generally, the most common method is called the soap and soda method, where you add washing soda, basically, or some chemical that increases the pH of the solution. You don't want it to be so much. They want the pH to be somewhere around 10, 9 or 10, if I'm not mistaken. You don't want it to be so high that it turns the silk into snot, but just enough that it kind of loosens the sericin coating. And then you also add, historically it was like Castile soap or olive oil based soap. But nowadays, it's not uncommon to use something like a surfactant, like sodium lauryl sulfate or something that can then kind of help facilitate the removal of that to separate it from the silk. Okay,
cool. And just one more thought here from Sandra. A novelist's description of reeling the silk from the cocoons is Gail Tsukiyama's Women of the Silk. So she was just throwing that
nice.
Novel out.
Great, okay.
To track down. Yes, okay. I think we'll have any more questions from this point and let you continue. Thank you.
Heck yeah. Okay, I hope you folks are enjoying so far.
Seems like it.
Good. Okay, so then moving beyond kind of like raw material inputs and like what's the thing made of, I thought it'd be neat to kind of touch briefly on natural dyes and treatments that are used. So the whole world of natural dyes, a shout out to my friend Kaylee, who had kind of like helped me like fall down the rabbit hole of this in terms of like a hobby. I was always aware of it and had done experiments like in school, but I hadn't done much as a hobby. So this has been kind of a fun quarantine activity for me over the last number of months. But generally, if we're talking about dyes, I think the majority of them are basically plant-based, plant-adjacent based, but there are some insect-derived dyes as well. And then I have like one slide talking about examples of some treatments that are used that are derived from natural products. So first, a disclaimer: if you folks are in Vancouver, if you've never heard of Maiwa, highly recommend checking them out. I have used this guide to natural dyes extensively. I think it's available free online, and they're so open about sharing their knowledge. It's like they're a great resource, so highly recommend. And I also would recommend a couple of books that I've played around with. Wild Color, which is one I borrowed from a friend, but this one, The Art and Science of Natural Dyes. If you are like me, predominantly like a science person, but with some kind of artistic tendencies or interests, I think you would love this book because it's a team, Joy and Catherine. Joy is a textile chemist and Catherine is an artist. So between the two of them, they have this lovely just show you an example of one page where they have this series of experiments they've done. This is indigo dyeing, where this is showing kind of the depth of shade you get from multiple immersions in the dye vat. And it's just, the whole book is full of stuff like that, where it's like, this is what this looks like if you use this treatment or that treatment or this mordant or this pH, or if you combine it with that. And it's just lovely. I'm a fan, so would recommend. But I thought, I mean, there's like so many things out there, but I thought I would just do like a real high level, just like, this is neat. These are some things you can do. So some popular dyeing plants that are used. Madder is a really popular one, which where the dye is extracted from the roots. Indigo is another really popular one. Obviously, like jeans now are made from synthetic indigo, but you can still buy in like natural indigo dyed textiles, mostly from kind of smaller, like Mawa, for example. You can buy indigo textiles from them, or you can dye your own. And then I included this one in here, onion skins, which is super fun and something I've been playing around with. Here's an example of what that looks like. So this on the left here is a photo that we used for promoting this event. So that should be, you can see that, and you can get, like, all of these yarn skeins were dyed with madder, but you can kind of play around with the effect you get by playing around with like additives to the dye bath, like if you make it more alkaline or more acidic, or if you use different what we call mordanting agents, which are chemicals that kind of help the dye bind to the yarn. In most cases, you do need to have what we call a mordant. Alum is really common. You can boil rhubarb leaves apparently to help mordant, and other things. Indigo, this house coat that I saw and immediately fell in love with. This is a neat one where it's a combination of indigo with resist dyeing techniques. So shibori, if you've ever heard of that, it's a traditional Japanese resist dyeing technique. It's like super fancy tie-dye, basically. And then here's an example of a yarn that was dyed with onion skins. It's this beautiful kind of golden color. You can also use kitchen waste. So I personally have a copy of this one, and this is a really fun way to kind of dip your toes in the water if you don't want to go all in and buy a whole bunch of different things. But I love this book especially because they have, for example, I'm on coffee. They have like a recipe. They give you a recipe you can use, and then, you know, with that coffee that you just made, you can dye your yarn. And then they give you instructions on how much to use and how to prepare the yarn, and so that's kind of fun. That's a neat way to kind of introduce yourself if you were interested in starting this as a hobby. So you can use avocado pits and skins. You can use black beans. You can use what else is in there? There's cabbage. You said coffee, rhubarb, onion skins, all kinds of fun stuff. And then this slide, so lichen is another material that has been used historically for a very, very, very long time. Predates all of us for sure. And this image, this comes from the Beaty Museum. This kind of served as one of the inspirations for me giving this talk. My friend Nicole, who works at the Beaty Museum, showed me this image, and it was like, oh, this is super cool. Yeah, okay, let's do a talk around textiles in the natural world and all of these things. So there's a number of species of lichen that are used for dyeing plants, for dyeing yarns, I should say. And although lichen technically aren't plants, there's a symbiosis between algae and fungi, which is pretty cool. I digress, but I have collected some lichens on my walks here on the North Shore, but I haven't actually dyed anything yet, but it's like next on my to-do list. But you can basically, because they also contain a high concentration of tannins, apparently you can just dye them straight in like a boiling water, straightforward boiling water extraction, depending, and the color you get depends on the species of lichen that you have collected. Or you can do this ammonia extraction method, which historically used urine to extract the color, and it's kind of like this urea fermentation process that sounds kind of gross, but really cool. And apparently you can do that yourself if you collect the right species in an ethical way. So never pick the lichen off of the rocks. You have to collect it lichen that's kind of naturally fallen and isn't attached to anything. there's a big concern there with making sure that you're collecting these things ethically. I have not yet been able to find any species of lichen that would give that vibrant purple, but I would love to try, where you effectively, you can use household ammonia. Well, these days it's pretty hard to get a hold of it, but, and you create this kind of fermentation vat that you kind of regularly agitate, and it can take weeks to develop the color, but it sounds really cool and creates these like beautiful, vivid purple colors. Here's a couple other resources on that. So this is a book, Lichen Dyes, that I've been reading, where she goes over all of that, concerns about ethical collection and kind of the history, both with First Nations people in North America, and then also the history of lichen dyes in the UK, the British Isles. Some neat stories in here and some neat how-tos depending on the species that you found and how you can kind of help figure out what kind of lichen you have and what process you want to go through. I also threw this up here, micropigments. I just discovered these on my adventures preparing for this talk. Unfortunately, you know, in COVID times, probably not going to happen, but they have some kind of like workshop or symposium happening in October that in the before times, I would have been all over that. But looking at kind of dyeing with mushroom pigments is something else that I'm keen about looking into as well. Then moving into animal sources. So I've always said cochineal, but apparently I'm saying it wrong. It's cochineal or something. But basically, these guys are really actually quite common critters used to create dyes in food additives as well. And they're super, super potent. Like you need very little to get a really vibrant red color. And so these ones, you can see this person has kind of picked a scale insect off of this cactus and smushed it with their finger. And you have this like really vibrant red. And then of course, historically, Tyrion Purple, which is collected from muricid snails, is one of like the OG purple dyes that were used in like ancient Greece before they discovered lichen dyeing to get those rich purples as well. Apparently, it didn't smell very good. It smelled really fishy. So here's an example of kind of what those visuals look like. I would actually be surprised if these fabric examples here were actually dyed with Tyrion Purple, because like if you had a roll of fabric, those things would have cost like thousands of dollars. Probably conventional dyes that are just made to mimic the color. But and then here is just kind of a neat example of using cochineal. And yeah, so here's some examples of some things I've been doing in COVID times. So these two skeins of yarn here, I dyed with madder. So I did a really concentrated dye bath for this top one and like a dark gray yarn. And then I just used what was left over with a white yarn underneath. So I'm going to do like a 2-color combo with that. I haven't decided what I want to make with it yet. This was one where I tried to do a good like gradient yarn with onion on one end and cochineal on the other to get kind of like a pink to yellow transition. Didn't work out as well as I thought, but it looked pretty cool in the finished product. This is one that I thought it turned out really nicely. You've got logwood on one end and then onion skins on the other. This is all onion, and then I found a pattern that mimics onions, so that was kind of cute. And then these I dyed with logwood. So just an example of some things you can do. You do need to use dedicated dye equipment when you're working with these. You can't just use like the pots and pans that you use for cooking food, but you can get like nice big dye pots and utensils at a thrift store for like $1. Like it doesn't have to break the bank, but just a heads up that you do need to use separate equipment for these things. And then on the treatment side of things, just an example of things that are actually used. Beeswax is becoming increasingly popular. Waxed cotton, I don't think has ever really stopped being produced, but I think, and it still is mostly like paraffin wax, petroleum-based waxes that are used. But I think beeswax treated cotton is becoming a lot more popular, and especially like those food wraps, that's effectively what it is. It's just got much higher concentration of wax to help it kind of stick to itself. So those food wraps that people have been using instead of plastic wrap, for example, similar idea. And that's just a treatment to kind of help the cotton resist water, getting wet out by water. This is a blob of lanolin, which is used in a lot of skincare products. Like I think this image I got from the Lush website, but it's not uncommon for lanolin, extra lanolin, to be added to like knitting yarns. And some people, I feel like there's a line of yarns out there where it actually like they advertise that it softens your hands as you knit, because they have added lanolin in there. It's not super common because a lot of people do actually react to it. They have allergic reactions to it. So, but lanolin is basically just sheep grease, and it's removed. Most of it's removed in the wool kind of cleaning and processing. If you buy like a rustic wool yarn, often there's still a fairly high amount of lanolin still left in the yarn, but a lot of it's been removed. And then starches and sizing. So sizing is, in the textile industry, it's used to describe a substance that yarns are coated with to protect them from abrasion while weaving, particularly if you're familiar with textile terminology, the warp, so the lengthwise direction. Those yarns are put under a lot of tension and stress. And so oftentimes when you're weaving a fabric, all of those yarns are treated with sizing, often a water-soluble starch that protects the yarns. And then once the fabric has been woven, you remove that sizing. So that's still very commonly used in the industry. So before we move on to the sustainability part, I realize that we're like basically over time. I can keep going if you folks are cool with keeping going, or we can wrap it up whenever, but I feel like there's probably questions at this point.
Yes, so let's maybe just cover a couple more questions here before we move on. Okay, we have let's see, Kim suggesting she just read Fiber Shed, a great book that started with an indigo growing project. Someone asked, how do you fix natural dyes? I think
it's effectively by using a mordant. You have to make sure that with a lot of things in textiles, preparation is like the most important key to success. It has to be like washed, it has to be scoured and mordanted properly.
Yes, Sandra mentioned turmeric. So can you comment on turmeric?
Yeah, you can dye with turmeric. I have played around with it without any kind of mordanting agent. It stains for sure, but it's not fast. So fastness is what we refer to as the ability of a dye to like stay in the fabric through laundering or exposure to UV. I think turmeric would probably be, I think it's common as like an additive, but I don't know how much people use it on its own because I think it doesn't have amazing fastness. I might be wrong on that, but you would have to use a mordant again.
Okay, we have a lengthy question from Newton on, you covered dyes, what dyes you use. She was asking, how do you test for neatness and evenness, tensile strength, twist texting?
Oh my goodness. Okay. Textile testing. Wow, we could have like another entire talk about that.
So
when it comes to,
sorry, do you want to hold that one and maybe do that at the end because we have a number of ones here?
Yeah, let's maybe hold that one for the end.
Yeah. Are textile dyes transferable to other arts? I am thinking of Pysanka or egg writing.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I think they're mostly acid dyes. Any dye that you would use to dye, I think protein yarns, you can also use on eggs, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. Are you aware of any differences or particular techniques in dyeing leather versus fabric slash wool?
Yeah. I feel like, again, you could probably use similar classes of dyes because they're protein based. I have never dyed leather myself. And I know that there's like other stuff going on there. Not an area of expertise of mine, I'm afraid.
Okay. Lots of lovely comments about your dye jobs and the color.
Oh, thank you.
Has human hair been used for textiles? This is from Nicole. Since it's continuously growing, she's curious if that's ever been tried.
Yeah, I'm sure it has been. And I know that human hair has been incorporated in kind of ceremonial dress or in everyday dress, really, in many cultures. I mean, even the Victorians incorporated human hair in like amulets and things over the years. In terms of like turning it into textile products, I'm not a textile historian. I will admit. So I'm sure it has happened. I can't think of any specific examples off the top of my head. I do know of people who've used cat and dog hair and spun yarn and made sweaters with them. So I feel like human hair is not a huge leap. It would probably be easier if your hair was curly. Like my hair would probably make a rubbish sweater. It wouldn't really hold together. But like my partner Ronan, he's got beautiful curly hair. I could probably, this is the creepiest thing I've said. I could probably make a sweater with his hair.
You might be surprised.
He just gave me a look.
Just a feedback from Nicole to say thank you. And I think hair scraps are used in oil absorbents for spills. So that's a pretty unique.
Yeah, I can see that for sure.
Okay, let's move on with sustainability. This is fun.
Okay, I'm so sorry if we're going over time, but like I'm happy if you guys are happy. So I'll
Let's
just keep
go.
going. Okay, sustainability. So fun quote I like is, you know, becoming more mindful about clothing and looking at every fiber, seed, and every dye, looking at everything kind of holistically, not just one aspect of it, but everything from kind of the raw material input to the finished product and to the end of life, and kind of looking at the whole cycle is really important if we're trying to make these changes that we need to make to address all kinds of issues. So, I mean, really high level, some of the problems that we're really dealing with as an industry, the clothing and textile market is bonkers huge, in the hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of how much revenue it generates annually. It's also one of the most complicated supply chains in manufacturing, and trying to, like, traceability is a huge theme in terms of trying to improve the visibility of like where everything is coming from. You know, you have a raw like cotton that's grown in like the southern US, and then that cotton is shipped to this other place, and it's, you know, woven in, this is not a real textile chain, I'm just like hypothesizing, but like say it's woven in like Japan, and then it's shipped to like a different facility to dye and finish it, and then it's shipped to the garment manufacturer in Romania, and then it's, you know, at a distribution center, and then it's shipped to the customer at the store, and like it's insane how many steps there are and how many opportunities there are in that for making improvements to the process. And then of course over the last 10-20 years or so, with the increase in fast fashion and kind of our throwaway culture, that has just kind of exacerbated issues that already existed before that became more popular. So I want to acknowledge that there are serious social costs with a lot of these things, especially when you have like a t-shirt that's like $7. I mean, you know, it's not realistic. How much is that person getting paid, and what working conditions are they in to produce that $7 t-shirt? That is absolutely something I want to acknowledge. It's not something I'm going to dive in too much right now, because I'm kind of focusing more on environmental impacts, especially myself as like a materials person. That's the majority of what I'm focusing on in my work. And I don't want to say things that aren't factual, because it's just not my area of expertise. But acknowledging it here, a very serious thing that we are all working to improve. But when you're looking at just kind of that basic, as I was saying, from the raw material to end of life, you've got, you know, pesticide use and the use of petrochemicals, all of the greenhouse gas emissions that come from collection and production and care and use. This infographic here is showing microfiber release, which is something that we're looking at a lot right now, as well as what happens to those textiles after they have reached the end of their usable life. And there's challenges with all fiber types. Nothing is perfect. There's no like one holy grail silver bullet solution. I mean, obviously, otherwise we'd be using it. But just some general kind of challenges we have. With natural fibers, often a lot of them are water intensive. They require the use of pesticides and fertilizers. There's land use concerns, animal welfare concerns when you're looking at kind of animal fibers there. When it comes to regenerated cellulosics, man-made cellulosics, most of those come from trees. So if those trees aren't harvested responsibly, you're looking at, you know, risks of clear cutting and irresponsible foresting practices. And as I mentioned earlier, harsh chemicals that are used in some kinds of these fibers. And then looking at synthetics, which we haven't talked a lot about right now, but in this talk, but traditionally they're based on non-renewable resources. They themselves aren't inherently biodegradable. And fiber shedding is has been shown to be an issue. So what are we doing about it? As I mentioned, it's important to kind of tackle this from a holistic perspective. So what I'm going to show you is just a really general overview. We could go much more in depth with a lot of these things, but I just kind of take screenshots, or of course this is going to be available, the recording's going to be available afterwards. So I just wanted to give you some things, terminology that we use, and like organizations that are doing work in this area. So if you were interested in learning more, that you kind of know where to go. So some of the things we're looking at, if we kind of look at that general division of fiber types again. So when it comes to natural fibers, using organic crops, and with that kind of organic certification often comes with reduced water and pesticide use, obviously reduced pesticide use. Looking at alternative fibers that are a bit less high maintenance, like hemp, for example. There's a big hemp industry in Alberta, my home province, because it seems to grow really well and it seems to be fairly low maintenance, which is great. On the regenerated cellulosic side, focusing on closed loop processes that don't require endless chemical inputs, but that you can't keep using. Looking at responsible sourcing, so taking raw inputs from certified plantations or recycled feedstock, which is something I'll touch on briefly. And then in the field of synthetics, which is actually most of the work I do at my job anyway, is looking at recycled content, but responsibly sourced recycled content. Bio-based plastics, so plastics that are produced using biological inputs. So castor oil is something that's gaining traction in that way, so that you're not so reliant on petrochemicals to produce these things. And then, of course, where appropriate, biodegradable additives. That one is a bit of a contentious issue because it depends on where that item is being disposed of, what's been added, if it truly is biodegradable, or if it's just kind of breaking down into microplastics and it's not really addressing the issue. We could talk a lot about that. So okay, here's my ridiculous slide of like all the things. And of course, even like 5 minutes before this presentation, I was like, oh crap, I could have added that one too. So this is by no means exhaustive, but here are some examples of things, logos you might see on a tag if you're shopping, or things you might see online. And you're like, what even is that? So one resource, I'll repeat it towards the end, but one resource, if you're particularly interested about kind of what we're calling preferred raw material inputs, the Textile Exchange is an amazing resource. And they kind of oversee a number of standards that the industry uses to kind of maintain supply chain transparency and responsibility. So for example, the responsible down standards, I've seen hang tags on down jackets of like traceable down and, scan this code and you can kind of see where it came from. The responsible wool standards, so making sure that sheep that are producing wool for you, I believe it's called the 5 freedoms. So things to ensure that you have happy sheep, you're getting fiber from happy sheep. There's certain practices that are used in certain areas of the world. One practice called mulesing, where the sheep are kind of intentionally harmed to distract parasitic flies from kind of damaging other areas of the sheep, which is like not happy. And global recycle standards. So this is a way that you can maintain transparency with recycled inputs. So one criticism of recycled fibers is that, especially ones that use like mechanically recycled pop bottles, for example, they're just like, well, if you're creating a demand for that, you're just causing the demand, like the production of more plastic bottles, which is what we're trying to avoid. And I mean, yeah, that is a valid concern. And so there are standards that you can use to kind of make sure that the source of that polymer isn't something shady. The Higg Index, or actually I'll talk about the Higg Index in a second. I have a screenshot on the next page. Things like the Better Cotton Initiative. So you've got organic cotton and like BCI cotton. So BCI supports farms that are in transition, so that want to become organic, but it's a whole process. It's not unlike, there are some food brands that do that as well, where they say, this isn't organic, but they're following organic practices because there's a certain length of time and tests that have to be done to ensure. Yeah, kind of this. Oh, sorry.
No, I seem to have lost you there for a minute. I just wasn't.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. It might be this end?
Oh, it says I'm getting an alert saying my internet connection is unstable. Okay.
Oh, ooh.
Oh,
Okay.
all
and
right. Fingers crossed.
just
Hopefully.
another thought. We're getting very close to the end.
Yes.
So yes. Keep going.
Okay, so I'm gonna skip over this, but just an FYI, there's a lot of stuff that you can look at. And this is an example of what's called the Higg Index, where the Material Sustainability Index, where you can kind of input, like, okay, I have this polyester fiber that's 20 denier and it's, you know, treated in this way, and you can kind of use that as a comparison tool if you're looking at different inputs and you want to see what kind of impact that material might have. And then so shameless plug for my employer, Terex, but there a lot of companies are actually publicly stating, like, these are the people we work with. This is where the fabric is made. This is where the garments are made. And just showing, like, this is what's happening and this is why we work with these people, to try to increase that transparency so people feel better about what they're buying, that they know that that we're not trying to hide anything shady, you know. And then, of course, fair trade certifications is also a popular thing to do. And then a few companies doing end of life considerations. So we've got EcoCircle by a Japanese company named Teijin, where they were bringing in used synthetic clothing and doing chemical or mechanical recycling, depending, I think, on the product, and then reconstituting that into new fibers so that you can kind of create that circular loop there. And then this company called Infinitive Fiber, I can't say that word, but they are doing something similar, but on kind of the regenerated cellulosic side. So they can take, you know, old jeans and then kind of break that down and create fiber from that. And then I have this whole slew of examples here I'm not going to go through because we've run out of time. So just as, like, I'm going to do a closing note, things to think about. The 6 R's of sustainability. So this goes for companies and for people. Rethinking traditional ways of doing things, trying to reuse and recycle and repair things instead of just throwing them away. There's a big movement, repair, you know, visible repairs, which is gaining traction. And being proud of, like, yeah, I repaired this. I didn't, you know, I'm not just going to throw it away because there's a snag. Obviously reducing purchases or consumption of things. So I think there's a trend towards people buying one product that does a lot of things instead of like 6 different products that each fill like a really specific niche. Or companies like Rent the Runway, where you don't have to buy that special occasion dress. You can just rent it for one night and then return it. These are all things that can kind of help you reduce your impact. And of course, refusing to purchase things that are not necessary. And that kind of ties into the rental side as well, or participating in things like Buy Nothing Day, which normally occurs, I think, on Black Friday and things like that. So maybe I'll wrap it up there. Oh, goodness. I could talk for a really long time about this, obviously.
That's very exciting. Thank you. Really, you've covered a lot of ground and all very, very interesting information. I'm really excited about the whole sustainability side of things because we're finding more and more of, you know, fish in the ocean, sustainability, where they're coming from, tracing where they were caught, et cetera, et cetera. So
Absolutely.
to hear that this is similar with your, with the textiles is, I think, a really good forward motion. Yeah.
Yes. And that shout out to Oceanwise, actually, local folks that are affiliated with the Vancouver Aquarium. They've partnered with a number of apparel brands to research microfiber release. So
yes, with Peter Ross. Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to, let me just check here on a few more chats. We've got, let's see, lots of, this was great. Thank you, Mary. Learned a lot. Very interesting from Arlene. Really enjoyed this segment. Enjoyed the presentation. I hope I haven't forgotten anyone in terms of just that bit on the, sorry, going back up the list. No new ones, and because we are a little bit over, is there anything that you did want to say about neatness and evenness
oh, sure. Yeah.
Maybe just a pinch.
Yeah, and I mean, for the person who asked that question, feel free to reach out to me on, I think I'm on LinkedIn. Just search my name on the internet. It's pretty easy to find me. We can have a more in-depth chat about that if you're interested, because there's a whole thing. But in terms of like evenness of dye, again, the big thing is just preparing the fabric really well. making sure that you've scoured it really evenly to get rid of any impurities, and that the mordanting has been done, and that there's a lot of that you're kind of agitating the fiber and the fabric and making sure there's enough room in the dye bath that it's not getting squashed and you're inadvertently creating a resist.
There you go. So that was Newton, Newton Owino, and perhaps Newton, if you're still online here, you can do as Mary
Oh, hey,
said.
thanks, Nicole. Nicole just shared a link to my LinkedIn. So yeah, just message me on there. We
There
can
you go.
have a chat.
Okay, 4 new messages. There's Nicole. Okay, already answered that one. Sorry, I got to get to the bottom of things here. This was great. I learned a lot. I think I already said that. I enjoyed the presentation. Very informative. Great talk, Mary. Thanks so much. Is it possible to have an email address for you? Well, that's just been uploaded. Contact email there from Nicole, and Laura says thanks, and yikes, I think we've done it.
Okay.
That was awesome. A really nice coverage. Oh, so many things to think about. I love fabrics, I love linens and cottons, but really good to hear about all that other all the other options, as well as more details on the industry in terms of processing the cellulose. That's really good to know. So unless we have any more quick questions coming in on the chat, I think we will probably wrap it up and say goodbye to everyone. Thanks again, Mary, for your presentation, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. Next week, next week, I think we will be talking about big bugs, and that will be by Vincent Saison of the interpretive team. So please do join in then, same time, same day, next Wednesday. Thanks so much, everyone, and hope to see you again.